Slavery is back.
Welcome to a place where private business profit from a captive labour force, yet pennies are spent on medical services to a population in which the Indigenous, the poor and the mentally ill are overrepresented. Where isolation, humiliation and degradation are facts of life. Welcome to prison.
It depends who's telling the story, I suppose. The prisoners would have one view, the people who work in the prison system would have another, and I think it's up to people to decide where the truth is.
Give government propaganda and the media spin doctors the flick. And check out Doin' Time for news, views and tunes on prison issues from Guantanamo Bay to Christmas Island to prisons and detention centres everywhere. Every Monday at 4 p.m. on your community radio 3CR.
We are still fired up and we're still talking about revolution.
Hello and welcome to the Doin' Time show. This is 3CR Community Radio, 855 AM on the dial, streaming live on www.3cr.org.au. This is Marisa and I'll be taking you through until 5 o'clock this evening. First up on the show, we're going to be speaking with Professor Lyndall Ryan, and we will be speaking with Lyndall about the massacres in Victoria. We were speaking off air today about the Frontier Wars, and there's so much to talk about. And what Lyndall and I decided was that we would actually talk about massacres in Victoria and talk a little bit about what the Frontier Wars mean. And there are so many stories. And so the Frontier Wars are really about acts of resistance. So it's not just that there were massacres, it's about putting that in context. And I'm hoping also to talk to Lyndall about the map, the digital map that she has created. And we'll talk about that. Well, not created, but done some research on. So we'll talk about that. My eyesight is quite poor, so I'm really hoping that she doesn't mind if I ask stupid questions. Before we proceed, I would just like to acknowledge all the people that died in the massacres and also to pay respect to them, and also to say that to listeners that there may be audio images of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that have died. This show has had a very long tradition of doing a lot of Aboriginal-led interviews on campaigns, and also we have done work about building the movement to stop Aboriginal deaths in custody, as well as doing work on refugees and asylum seekers and women in prison. And I've got a little bit of an ulterior motive, a hidden motive for talking about this stuff. I mean, I talk about this all year, but just to let you know that Radiothon is coming up, and it's so important to donate to keep our work alive. So we'll be speaking with Lyndall shortly, and then after that we'll be speaking with Stephen Kilkeary, who is the Director of Individual and Group Advocacy in New South Wales for People with Disability Australia. And we'll be speaking with Stephen about segregated living situations for people with disability, which is a recipe for abuse and neglect. And we'll be speaking with him about the Royal Commission and some hearings that are coming up in regards to neglect and abuse of people with disability. So before we move to speak with Lyndall, just to speak a little bit about her, and I'll be having her helping me talk about what land she's on later on. But Lyndall was born in Eora country in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and at the age of 10 she moved to Darug country in Sydney's southwestern outskirts. And since then she's lived in Canberra, Brisbane, Adelaide and New South Wales Central Coast and now Newcastle. And she says that she always seemed to have lived on a hill with a northern outlook. Now what I find really important to speak about with Lyndall is that she is best known as a historian of the Australian colonial frontier, and her first book, The Aboriginal Tasmanians, 1981, broke new ground in arguing that contrary to widespread belief, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people did not die out in 1876 or in any period in history. In the aftermath of the history wars and a debate about whether settler massacres of Aboriginal people were widespread on the colonial frontier, Lyndall made a careful study of the practice of massacre in other parts of the world and developed a typology to investigate the evidence of massacre of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on the colonial frontier in Australia. And in 2014, she gained a major research grant from the Australian Research Council to prepare a digital map of massacre sites of Aboriginal people across the Australian frontier, 1788 to 1930, which is when the frontier wars took place, and on the massacres. So we will now go over and speak to Professor Lyndall Ryan.
You're listening to 3CR Community Radio 855 AM on digital and online. 3CR Radical Radio.
And you're back with the Doing Time show. I think I just blew my nose and I think it came out on air. I've got a bit of a sinus infection. Sorry to listeners about that. Hello, Lyndall. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Marisa, for having me.
It's lovely to have you. Did you listen to the intro, Lyndall?
Yes, I did.
Lovely. So you know all about it. So I'm wondering if you could just, first of all, talk about what land you're from.
At the moment, I'm living on the land of the Awabakal people in Newcastle, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging in Awabakal country. It's a very lively Aboriginal community here.
Absolutely. And I believe you also were interviewed by Bo Spearham, who is a radio host as well and does a lot of work. He's a First Nations radio broadcaster.
Yes, indeed.
That's an excellent interview. I haven't had a chance to listen to it all yet. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us just about what actually happened with the massacres and maybe perhaps put it in context.
Well, I think the first massacres happened within 6 years of the first British people arriving in Sydney. It was 6 years after they arrived. We've got the first massacres being recorded in 1794, 1795, and we've got fairly consistent evidence of the massacres occurring right up until about 1930, possibly beyond, but we decided that we had such a long historical period to work on that we decided to stick with the period up to 1930. And what we found is that every time the British settlers tried to move out a bit further, they would encounter Aboriginal resistance, and that the settlers would then organise to massacre the Aboriginal people so they could take the Aboriginal land. The massacres were not the only way, of course, of killing Aboriginal people, but we think that the massacres were responsible for between 40 and 50% of all Aboriginal people killed overall. So it does play a very significant role. And we've got different forms of evidence of finding the massacre. We've got, particularly in northern Australia, where the massacres happened in the 20th century, we have some very important Aboriginal oral evidence, particularly where they've recorded it and it's been published. And that's quite a rich archive. But when we come to Victoria, most of the massacres happened in the period, 15-year period before gold was discovered in 1851. That is between about 1835 and 1850. And in that period, most of the western districts of Victoria were occupied by sheep farmers and cattle farmers, and Gippsland was occupied by cattle farmers, and they were very good at undertaking massacres to get rid of the Aboriginal people. And when you look at the massacre map, we've got more than 50 massacres across Victoria in that very limited time frame of about 15 years. So it was very swift, it was very bloody, and we know from statistics that about in that 15-year period, the Aboriginal population of Victoria dropped by at least 80% and probably more. So it was a pretty terrible time. But Aboriginal people did defend their land, and they died defending their land.
Absolutely. And the thing is that Australians and indeed people all over the world have been robbed of Australian history, because a lot of the time Aboriginal people were portrayed as inverted commas, savages, and in fact that were passive and didn't fight back, and that's not true.
It certainly isn't. And you always find when you've got an enemy who's causing you problems, like Aboriginal people were, they were very stoutly resisting the invasion of their country. And so whenever you have a so-called enemy, you're going to give them the worst possible name. You're going to call them savages. You're going to call them gooks. You're going to call them vermin. You're going to call them anything but people. In the Vietnam War, Australian soldiers tended to call the Viet Cong, people who were defending their land, as gooks and things like that. So you're always going to get a very negative term about the enemy. And sometimes these terms can reveal to the historian the fear that the invading settlers felt about the Aborigines. Their way of dealing with it was to deny them humanity, which justified their killing of them. And some of the work that I've done in Victoria indicates that the settlers felt they had every right to do it. They felt that the government wasn't giving them any support. Aboriginal people, although they were technically British subjects, in the British legal system, Aboriginal people were not allowed to appear in court to defend them, to be witnesses to any of these killings that took place. So the settlers had virtually everything going for them. And we've got, apart from the Myall Creek Massacre of 1838, which is one of the few times in Australia where the killers were brought to justice in court in Sydney. That's such a rare event that we've got not a lot of information through the legal system about what is going on. We have to look for other sources to help us understand. And so many people were killed, so many Aboriginal people were killed in Victoria that there's not a lot of, sort of consistent, reliable memory of what happened. They certainly have this psychic memory of the terrible violence. But it's up to the historians to go and really find the evidence of what, how and where it happened. And it's pretty hard work to do. I'm not the only one who's done it. There's been people before me 20, 30 and 40 years ago. And in the 1990s, the Macquarie community in Melbourne produced the first massacre map in Australia of the massacre sites that their communities had collected over the years, and it caused quite a kerfuffle at the time. So I've built on a lot of their work, and putting it on a digital map, it means that anybody can see it, and if they've got any problems with it or they've got more information or anything like that, we have a contact page where people can contact me and the research team and say, hey, I know about that massacre, but I think it's in the wrong place. I think it was in the next creek, not the one you've noticed, and we can talk about that. And if the research team feels, yes, upon reflection, we've looked at everything, it probably happened in the next creek rather than the one we've got on the map, we can change it. Or if other people have got other references, people have sent me copies of diaries from their ancestors that gives us more information. So being a digital project, it's live, it's ongoing all the time, and we can change it according to new information as it becomes available. And to date, nearly 1,000 people have contacted us over the last few years to clarify the information. Most people want this map to be as correct as possible, and they're very anxious that the information is there for everyone to see. So it's very much a national project. But Victoria is a good example of how and where the massacres happened. And Victoria is a good example of indicating that the massacres usually happen over a very short period of time, and then the settlers move on to the next place, and it begins all over again. So over a period of time, you get a range of settlers who are quite good at killing Aboriginal people en masse. They know how to plan it. They know when to attack. They know the kinds of people they're looking for, all of those kinds of things. So the story does tend to repeat itself, not all the time, but Victoria is a good case study of how you investigate frontier massacres in Australia.
So do you actually have examples on that map that you can, just a few massacres that you can tell listeners about in Victoria?
Yeah, all right. There's one quite close to Melbourne, out at Werribee, that took place not long after the settlers arrived. I'll just get it up on the map for you. And that took place not long after the first settlers arrived, and that's in July 1836. And this happened when Aboriginal Werribee at that stage was right on the frontier of settlement, just outside Melbourne. It's now almost a Melbourne suburb, but back then it was out in what we'd call the boondocks. And so a settler from Tasmania, Mr. Franks, and his shepherd had taken up a pastoral lease and had some sheep up there. And we think that the shepherd might have been interfering with Aboriginal women. And so the shepherd was killed in a payback by the Aboriginal community there. Well, when news reached Melbourne, then a couple of days later, a party of 17 settlers armed with muskets went out and searched for the alleged murderers. And we think that at least 10 Aboriginal people were shot. Now, news of that reached, strange enough, it didn't reach Sydney very quickly, but it did reach Hobart because many of the settlers had come up from Tasmania. So the colonial secretary in Hobart wrote to the colonial secretary in Sydney about this and said from what he had heard, these 17 people came up with the Aboriginal people who were camped. About 50 of them were camped around Werribee, and they attacked the camp at dawn, and they killed at least 10 people. Well, the colonial secretary in Sydney then demanded that an inquiry should be held by the magistrate in Melbourne, and he interviewed many of those 17 people, and they all denied that anything had happened. Yes, they did go out looking for the murderers of, the shepherd and so on, but that they denied that they said, yes, they'd fired some shots, but it was, a bit dark, and they weren't quite sure where they were firing. And so the official report just indicates that nothing happened. But other people...
I'm not surprised, really.
So nothing's really changed, has it?
No.
This sense of denial. And he, this idea, he's one of the 17 men said, I think I'd heard that one of the Aboriginal men was wounded, but that he paid no attention to it at the time. In other words, they all colluded, and this code of silence is developed. And this becomes so common when you read in the official sources, when you've got incidents like this that get chased up by the authorities, all the attackers, they go in for a code of silence, they nothing, sir, nothing to see here, but we do know that there were probably 10 Aboriginal people killed, probably more, but we know that at least 10. This is very typical. We get it all over Australia. A story hits the newspapers that a group of settlers up in Queensland had attacked an Aboriginal camp and at least 10 were killed. The magistrate holds an inquiry. He interviews all the alleged attackers. They all deny that anything happened. But in the case of this one at Werribee, 30 years later, one of the attackers admits that they shot at least 10 people. It's long after he can be arrested, and it's long after his mates are going to get him if he speaks out. So it's breaking the code of silence that is really the key to understanding the evidence of massacre. And that's where the historian has to do a lot of hard work.
Oh. So this person's still alive, right? That admitted.
Sorry? Oh, yes.
This is the person that admitted. How can he sleep at night?
These are all young men. You know, you don't get old men going out committing massacre. These are men usually aged between 15 and 35. And those who are 15-year-olds are often a bit freaked by what happens. You know, they might be a bit gung-ho at the time, but later on it begins to gnaw at them. It eats into them. And often when they marry themselves and have their own children, they might get nightmares about the young Aboriginal children that they killed in these massacres. And the need to tell starts to take over. And we've got quite a few cases like this in Victoria where, a guy in his late 70s or 80s will talk to a journalist who might be visiting a town for another reason entirely and say, I want to show you the site where it happened and I want to tell you what happened. They need to get it off their chest.
Of course.
So it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. We don't get it in every case, but relying on that kind of evidence is really important for the historian.
It is important, and in fact, wouldn't it be amazing, Lyndall, if we could have memorial sites and like at Myall Creek?
Yes, I think we're beginning to see more of them too. I think that in some areas, in some places, local communities do want to come together and acknowledge what happened, and a memorial is a really important way of doing it. So it would be good to see that Myall Creek, I think, is sort of setting the example of what can be done. And we know that the memorial at Myall Creek, it took about 10 years to happen, but since the memorial was first opened 20 years ago, each year when the site is acknowledged, more and more people come. Some of them come from all over Australia. They want to acknowledge what happened. And it's a deeply moving ceremony. And if anyone gets the opportunity to go in a year, it's always in the Queen's birthday weekend because the massacre happened on the 10th of June. And it's a very important moment to be there. Very moving. And I think that we could get a number of sites across Victoria where people could acknowledge these horrendous events.
And where is the event taking place?
Sorry?
Where is the event taking place, the memorial for Myall Creek?
At Myall Creek itself. The event, it's in northern New South Wales. It's about 30 kilometres east of Inverell, and it's on the road to Macquarie. And the site has been excised from the original property, and it has now been heritage listed, and it has a big granite memorial that has been there to acknowledge by the Friends of Myall Creek. And the Friends of Myall Creek are equally Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. They want to work together. And I think the Friends of Myall Creek are setting the example of what Australians can do across the rest of the country to acknowledge the massacres that happened near where they live or in a nearby town or a place like that. So it's a deeply moving service. It takes place over the course of about 3 or 4 hours, a great coming together with morning tea and lunch, and in between this very powerful ceremony, and it's a great thing to do. It's a really important thing to do, and I think just attending it opens the eyes to us all about just how terrible this period of Australian history was for Aboriginal people.
Thank you so much for coming onto the program, Lyndall, and I'm hoping that I can have you back pretty soon, actually. But in terms of the map, can you just tell listeners able to know the link so that they can have a look at that map and help out if they need to?
Look, if you just go on to Google and put in the word colonial massacres, that usually takes you automatically to the link, and then you can click on the link and the map appears and so on. So we've tried to make it as accessible as possible.
Any final comments, Lyndall?
Well, I guess the final comment I'd like to make is that the ceremony at Myall Creek on the Queen's birthday weekend, I think, is becoming one of the most important events in Australia at the moment, because it's one of the few opportunities for all Australians to acknowledge this very violent past that Australia has. We've been brought up to believe that Australia was peacefully settled. We now know that is certainly not the case. It was very violent. Lots of Aboriginal people lost their lives, and it's up to us to acknowledge that the importance of that, so that we can understand who we are as Australians today.
We must acknowledge it, and we need to work together and unite.
Yes, I think that's very important. It's a long time coming, and it's not going to happen overnight, but we have to start the process.
Yeah, I remember when I first started doing this show, there were quite a few Aboriginal people that didn't want to talk about the massacres at all, and
That's right.
really,
it's still
really fantastic that people are talking about it.
It's very hard. It's very hard for many communities. There's no question about that, and one has to acknowledge that and be very respectful of that.
Yes.
But I've also found that some communities, when they've seen the map, like to talk about it amongst themselves, and then they might contact me and say, we would like to give you information about a massacre that happened to our people. So things don't happen overnight. They happen over a period of time. And history is like that. It takes time. So we're hoping that the map, does open the eyes to all Australians about what happened. And what we've got on the map, the number of sites, really, it'd be lucky, it's just those that we know about, that the research team has been able to find information about. There's a lot of others that will probably never get on the map because no one will ever talk about them. So it's only an indication. The map is only indicative. It's not, we can't possibly attempt to put everything that happened. But the map will give you an indication of what happened and how it happened.
Absolutely. And perhaps this is going to sound really confronting, what I'm about to say, but is it fair to say that in some ways, we've still got the families and friends of Aboriginal people dying in custody, and the people are still dying? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say. What happens in the aftermath of massacre? What massacre does, it destroys that community. If you've got a community of 20 Aboriginal people, which is how most Aboriginal communities lived back then, and you kill 6 people in one go, That's 30% of the community. They're not going to be able to continue as they were. They're not in a position to acknowledge country. They're vulnerable to further attack. They're vulnerable to European disease. They're not able to hunt and gather food in the way that they could before, perform ceremonial, or reproduce the next generation. They're destroyed. And what we're seeing today is the aftermath of these massacres and how people in the aftermath, all these things happened to them. Many were rounded up. Others, were arrested for various other things. And then you've got the whole of the living on reserves and their lives very restricted, and then the stolen generation. Massacre is part of that whole process of the colonisation of Aboriginal people, and it's still going on.
Exactly, and thank you for making that point, Lyndall, because what I really wanted to say here is that it's not just about the past.
No.
It's happening now.
Very much so. And I think we can see very strongly between the massacres that happened in the past and what is happening with Aboriginal people today.
Professor Lyndall Ryan, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I've really learnt a lot, and I've really enjoyed your company. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
3CR.
I think Welcome to Country is a very dangerous concept and initiative. I really don't know where Welcome to Country even merged from. I know that I don't think it was obviously an Aboriginal initiative. I think obviously governments had introduced that as they were pacifying our flag of resistance. The idealism that lies behind that obviously is so that white people can feel a sense that they're more guests and they've got a right of ownership and to be here. If we're going to continuously welcome them to country, what that does, it rectitudes the fact of the moral racism issues in which they perpetrate against our people. Because how can we be talking about all these other issues and then compromise a hypocrisy in our own selves to welcome these murderers and these slave traders, this barbaric sense of what they've done to occupy Australia on one hand and welcome them on the other.
You're listening to Radical Radio 3CR.
And you're back with the Doing Time show, and I'm doing the show remotely from home today. It's approximately 4:33, and we just heard an interview previously with Professor Lyndall Ryan, and she was speaking about the frontier wars and the massacres, in particular massacres in Victoria. And just before we get on to our next interview, I just wanted to say that she's been doing a lot of research, and the digital map of massacre sites of Aboriginal people across the Australian frontier, 1788 to 1930, there will actually be a stage 3 map released pretty soon. So look out for that. And next up, we're speaking with Stephen Kilkeary, who is the Director of Individual and Group Advocacy in New South Wales, People with Disability Australia. And I invited actually Stephen onto the show to speak about the Royal Commission and to talk about segregated living situations for people with disability. And basically, it's a recipe for abuse and neglect. And we're going to be speaking about a recent media release that has just been produced by People with Disability Australia. And the Disability Royal Commission is holding a hearing this week on preventing and responding to abuse in disability services. And I'm hoping that Stephen can talk about not only the Royal Commission but also speak about the case study involving the experiences of people with disability who live in the group home in Western Sydney operated by a non-government disability service provider, Sunnyfield Disability Services. And there's not really a lot of coverage on the Royal Commission, so it's quite important that we talk about people with disability who are rendered invisible a lot of the time. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to the program.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very glowing introduction.
It's lovely to have you. Now, Stephen, I'm wondering if you could just talk to us about what's been going on with people with disability, and I believe you've been doing some advocacy around this topic, and speak about it in context of the Royal Commission.
Yeah. Like many disability advocacy organisations, for many years we've had serious concerns about people in segregated or congregate living, which has different names across Australia. For example, things like boarding houses here in New South Wales, I think they're called rooming houses. In Victoria, they have other names elsewhere. But generally, our deep concern is basically that this is in serious breach of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and in particular Article 19, which talks about people with disability being able to live independently and also being in the community. And that's a really important thing that gets lost when you basically have governments across Australia effectively warehousing people in these sort of congregate settings for all sorts of reasons. Top of the tree, I'd have to say, would be the economic reason. It's more expedient to have a whole lot of people living under one roof from an economic point of view, although from what we see, it's repugnant and obnoxious that people with disability are denied the right to choose, where, how, and with whom they should live, and that should always be in the community.
So there's been quite a brutal history, hasn't there, in regards to people with disability, institutions and violence and neglect. And would you say that, a lot of people would say that that's a thing of the past. Would you say that's true?
No, I'd have to say, unfortunately. I'd say unfortunately, because, obviously we want a situation where people aren't being abused. I mean, you take that as given. However, in my experience, both here in New South Wales and in Victoria, also the experience of our agency and other like agencies, what we're seeing is pretty much that the same sorts of problems that have occurred, for example, in the bigger type sort of institutions that were once scattered across Australia. Many of those, or most of those, in fact, have now closed. But what we're seeing is a phenomenon that it was Brian Burdekin, actually, who was the Human Rights Commissioner way back, I think, to stretching my memory, to the early 1990s. I think he visited a rooming house in Footscray to basically point out, how barbaric and institutional these places could be. And he used the term mini-institutions. Now, if you turn to the general comment related to Article 19, there's a very good passage in that general comment. It's fairly accessible on the web. Anybody can look it up. And they talk about, you don't need a big institution to institutionalise people. A group home, for example, the DRC is talking about group homes this week, can be just as institutionalising as, let's say Ballarat Hospital or Morisset Hospital here or Stockton Centre, the sorts of places, or Basil Stafford in Queensland. All these sorts of archaic institutions that many of us sort of think, well, as you pointed out, that was the past. We've sort of moved on. Things have progressed. But we see in our work, our advocates, my team, the team of my colleague in Queensland, we see this sort of institutional type structural violence played out on a daily basis. But it's become somewhat more insidious and more difficult to sort of, take stock of and do something about. And clearly that's something we're hoping that, the Disability Royal Commission can really pick up on. In fact, I do know that, that they are paying specific attention to these sorts of settings, and it's really great that they're taking a look at one group home this week here in Sydney.
So, Stephen, can you just tell us a little bit about, has this information been released about the violence as yet?
When you say the violence, you mean the violence just generally, or?
No, sorry, with this particular case study.
Well, this particular case study relates to one group home.
Yeah.
And I can't speak specifically to that, but what I can say is that these sorts of problems are endemic across many group homes. And that's because, when you set up an institution, and that's what these places often are, where basically, there's control over what people can do. It goes often to one service provider. There's a lack of safeguards. PWDA would see this as a really critical issue. For example, here in New South Wales, as you have down there in Victoria, we have a visitor scheme. Down there it comes under the Office of the Public Advocate. Here in New South Wales, it comes under the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission. But in both situations, I know the scheme in Victoria is a volunteer scheme. Here in New South Wales, it's pretty close to that. Here in New South Wales, the official community visitors struggle to basically meet 55%, I think, visit 55% of the places they're supposed to visit. So in other words, you've got these group homes operating as mini institutions without safeguards, without accountability, and an even more frustrating thing is when things do happen, in terms of reaching out who is going to help, well, that becomes even more problematic. I know in the press release that we've put out, PWDA has put out, we talked about the conduct of police, and I think that's a really important point because I think underlying a lot of this violence against people with disability is the idea it's not really a police matter. It's not something, for example, that an ordinary citizen, if you're assaulted in the street, you'd have the expectation that the police would respond and charges would be laid, etc., that sort of thing. But when it comes to people with disability, it's like, oh no, it's more like, I'll give you an example, and I won't name names, but there's a very significant statutory body here in New South Wales, and they used to who had a key role in safeguarding, and they used to refer to basically violence against people with disability in group homes, and the response to that as being a matter of, and I'm quoting, service delivery improvement. That's how they frame it. It was service delivery improvement. We're talking about assaults, sometimes sexual assaults, exploitation, a huge amount of financial exploitation. That's a really big problem in group homes that I've observed here in New South Wales, certainly over the last 2 decades. And I think that's one of the critical things that the disability rights movement would like to progress, and that is that these acts of violence need to be seen as acts of violence and responded to as acts of violence. And again, we're really, placing our bets on the Disability Law Commission, identifying that. I can say that the Disability Law Commission has, thankfully, articulated the view that group homes are problematic. And to me, that's a really positive step because previously group homes were often characterised pretty much as being, well, like a home, And I'm not saying there aren't good group homes out there. There are. But very often, they set themselves up so that basically the way they're structured, the way they're operated, the lack of safeguards, that the residents, not only do they lose, choice and control, but also that they are vulnerable to violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation.
Absolutely. And in fact, I have been involved in a lot of disability rights activism, in particular in the 1980s. Yep. And, a lot of people with disability are terrified of being locked up in an institution or a group home. And nothing has changed today. It appears to me, and I'm just having a look at your media release, and I wanted to draw attention to something here. You were speaking before about how people in the street can go to the police. Well, basically what you're saying is that if there is violence and abuse in a group home, and I imagine there is, then they only do an internal investigation, don't they? And those service providers are not held accountable, correct?
Yeah, well, in extreme circumstances, there's no choice but to involve the police, but very often these things are indeed dealt with internally, and the processes involved aren't transparent. And the role, for example, of the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, I have to say, from our experience at PWDA, we're unsure exactly what they're supposed to do. But what we do know, and there are, of course, the Anne-Marie Smith case in South Australia, for example, points to, that was in the person's own home, but nonetheless, it points to that lack of safeguards. And this is something that PWDA has also pointed out and is pushing for, And that is we have multiple, I think someone counted 37, I could stand corrected, but we have multiple safeguards in place which are meant to protect people with disability from violence, and yet it seems that those things do not work. And we're actually calling for a national safeguard mechanism so that we can bring an end to the sorts of violence that occurs. But more especially, what we're facing now, for example, here in New South Wales is almost a reinvigoration, if you like, and reinvigoration is probably not the word I'd want to choose, but reinvigoration of the boarding house sector. Now, I scratch my head thinking, how can it possibly be in 2021 that we're looking forward to institutionalising people with disability? Instead of turning to the CRPD, instead of evincing the words stated in Article 19 in particular about the idea of living in the community, we're actually saying, no, it's okay to warehouse people with disability in these mini institutions, and some of which will contain, I've been told, up to 15 residents. And I'm sure they'll look good from the outside. They'll look better than some of the older type boarding house places here in New South Wales and rooming house places there in Victoria. But nonetheless, they'll still be locking people up effectively, denying them choice control, denying people with disability the right to actually, live the life of their own choosing in the community and be subject to all sorts of these, structured rules and regulations around how they can conduct their lives. So this is something, obviously, that we're meant to stand up for the CRPD. Australia signed on to that convention and its optional protocol. So that's something we need to keep fighting for, to make sure that the rights of people with disability, are heard and understood. And on that point of understanding, I think there's still a lot of, misinformation out there about people with disability. We get told, for example, that, this is the best that you can get. That's actually not true. There are plenty of examples we can draw from our own experience at PWD and elsewhere, where people, even with so-called severe impairment, if I can use that term, are able to live quite well as they want in the community. And as I said before, a lot of this just comes back to money. The NDIS, I think, has been problematic in this whole scenario, and I've followed and been involved with the NDIS since its inception. And one of the critical concerns there is around what they call, and apologies for this, I'm not a closet neocon, but they talk about a thing called the thin end of the market. And what does the thin end of the market mean in reality? Well, it means basically all those people, for whom exercising their choice and control, living as those people wish in the community, might, dare I say it, God forbid, cost the government some money. And I've seen, I know it's horrible, but I've seen
it's true. Yeah,
it's true. It's been handballed by governments.
Absolutely.
For the last 5 years or more. And what does that mean? Well, for one, it means, that's why it suddenly becomes palatable to, as I said before, warehouse people with disability in these mini institutions. It also means, for example, that, people in group homes where they can't provide the support because government shifted, responsibility over to the private sector or, in some cases the NGO sector. And we know of occasions where many people with disability who can't be supported in group homes are being evicted. Now, you've said you've had experience in the disability sector. The whole concept of people with disability being evicted from their group homes is unconscionable.
It really is, Stephen.
I'm not going to sit here start praising ADAC here in New South Wales or DHHS or whatever it's calling itself these days in Victoria, but that would never happen back in the day. And where do those people end up? Well, I can tell you one place where they end up, because we know this from our experience, and that is they end up blocking beds in psychiatric hospitals. Yeah. Now, what a pitiful situation, basically, in terms of not supporting people with disability. So, in other words, we overlay this neoliberal model that the market will sort out every problem, knowing that won't work. We hand over responsibility for service delivery to companies, whether they're constituted as NGOs, they're still companies. And then the whole thing breaks down, and who suffers, of course, those with the greatest support needs. To me, that's just morally so offensive. I just can't believe it. So, our opposition to group homes is based on the fact that this is something decided by others. This is a model of practice that hasn't worked. It takes away the concept of genuine choice and control. It warehouses people with disabilities together. It basically removes, if you like, safeguards that should be in place. And so what we'd like to see is let's turn things around. Let's get back to the idea that people with disability can and should be able to be supported to choose where and how they live. And if we did that, I mean, obviously that would be upholding people's human rights, which I'd hope in a civilised and sophisticated country like Australia is something we'd be doing. But the other thing is, even if you are whatever the word is, a market junkie, it actually makes economic sense because, actually abusing people is not, how can I say it, cost effective. It's actually wrong on so many levels to be perpetuating these sorts of models.
Absolutely. And also, just to draw attention to listeners here, that segregated housing systems for people with disability, providers have exceptional control over residents' day-to-day activities. I mean, for example, if people are using wheelchairs, some of them would need to be showered, wouldn't they? And there would be, room for sexual assault in that particular arena, wouldn't there?
Yeah, and this is something else that concerns me. We've sort of moved to an era where we're all uttering from the textbook of the NDIS, and I've been in settings where the NDIS people will say, well, if someone's being abused in let's say a group home, they'll just know what to do. They'll call the right person and get it sorted. And my first response to that is, please, can you just do some really basic, fundamental reading about what it means to be institutionalised and the challenges, that a person with disability would face, in terms of identifying and then being able to take the appropriate steps to stop that abuse. And so I think this is what I call a misuse of the concept of choice and control. I get told, for example, that people have circles of support. Well, I hope we do, but people who, for example, group homes and boarding houses often miss out on that. And then there's all the sorts of violence that people out there, your listeners included, very often wouldn't think of as being violence. For example, the mandatory use of psychotropic medication, which is very, very common in boarding houses and group homes. And what does that mean? Well, it means, for one, you end up in situations where almost everybody in a group home or boarding house setting can be on clozapine. Now, I'm not saying in cases where that's medically indicated that perhaps might be an option, but when you've got a situation where everybody just stays on the medication, despite the fact that it can be quite toxic, despite its many side effects.
That can be construed as a form of violence.
Well, it is. The CRPD is quite clear that coerced or forced medication breaches the convention. And so, these are the sorts of situations that we're seeing, and this is why we put out the press release calling for some change in this space.
I'm so glad, Stephen, that you come onto the program. We're going to have to wrap up soon. We've got a couple of minutes left. And just quickly, I believe that Anne-Marie Smith died on the watch of NDIS during their watch, right?
Yeah, I think that example, and there are other examples like that, points to a very unfortunate problem. And one of those problems, of course, was around a core issue with regard to Anne-Marie Smith, and that was that everything defaulted to one service, and indeed it seemed one worker. And I've been told that will change, but what won't change is a more critical problem as I see it, and that is you get very, very often you'll get people who've got involvement from NDIS, health, mental health, and other services, and yet with all these services involved, everyone doesn't seem to be doing anything at all. Apologies if the grammar doesn't sound correct, because it's not meant to. And we had another case here in New South Wales where a gentleman had been discharged from long stay at a terrible psychiatric hospital here. Mental health at that hospital, and I'm talking about mental health professionals, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists. They just wash their hands of supporting this gentleman.
I imagine they would. Stephen,
just quickly, he had NDIS, and they too stepped out. He ultimately died. I understand he died of starvation in his own home.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised, Stephen. Can I have you back again in the next couple of weeks? Is that okay?
Absolutely. That'd be great.
That'd be fantastic. And anybody that's interested in the Royal Commission, go onto the website. And, we'll be talking about the Royal Commission later on anyway as well. Stephen, thank you so much for coming onto the program, and I'm hoping that this is successful.
Thank you very much. It was excellent.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, you mob. It's up to all of us to keep checking in when we're out. Checking in is the quick and easy way to stop the spread of coronavirus and keep protecting our elders, communities and each other. Before you leave home, download the Service Victoria app and keep checking in, because checking in keeps us safe and open. Stay deadly, stay safe.
A 3CR supporter.
And it's goodbye from Marisa. Stay tuned every Monday from 4 to 5 for the Doing Time show. Black fella, white fella coming up next. Bye.
As long as you a true fella, as long as you a real fella. All the people of different races with different lives in different places. It doesn't matter what your name is. We got to have lots of changes. We need more brothers if we're to make it. We need more sisters if we're to save it. Are you the one?